you're a kid, you're always told monsters aren't real, but they're just in your imagination. But 8-year-old Tommy knew better. He'd heard the stories from older kids at school, the ones who swore that if you didn't check under your bed every night, something would crawl out while you slept. He used to laugh at them, thinking they were trying to scare him. But that all changed one cold October night. Tommy lived in a quiet, suburban neighborhood with his mom and dad. It was a cozy house, the kind where nothing bad ever seemed to happen, until that night. As usual, his mom kissed him goodnight, leaving his bedroom door slightly ajar, just enough to let in a sliver of light from the hallway. Tommy snuggled into his bed, pulling the covers up to his chin. He'd almost forgotten about the older kids' stories. Almost. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard it, a faint, scratching noise. It was subtle, like something sharp brushing against wood. His heart skipped a beat, and his eyes darted toward the source of the sound. It was coming from under his bed. For a moment, he thought maybe it was just his imagination, a trick his tired mind was playing on him. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. Tommy's stomach knotted in fear, but curiosity got the best of him. Slowly, he leaned over the edge of the bed, peering into the darkness below. Nothing. Just the usual collection of toys and dust bunnies. Relieved, he let out a shaky breath and pulled back into his covers. "It's nothing," he whispered to himself. But the moment his head hit the pillow, the scratching returned. This time, closer. He froze, his breathing quickened, and his small fingers gripped the edge of his blanket tightly. His mind raced, desperately, trying to rationalize what he was hearing. Maybe it's a mouse, he thought, but deep down he knew better. "Tommy," a low, raspy voice whispered from beneath the bed. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't a mouse. It wasn't anything normal. The voice was too quiet, too unnatural. "Tommy, come play with me." His heart pounded in his chest as he pulled the covers over his head, his whole body trembling. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying for it to go away. For a moment there was silence, and Tommy dared to hope that whatever it was had left. But then he felt it. A slow, deliberate tug on his blanket. He gasped, too terrified to move, his hands gripping the fabric with all his strength. The tug came again, harder this time. Tommy could hear the faint sound of breathing, just inches from his face, as if the thing from under the bed had crawled up next to him. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Tommy bolted upright and leaped out of bed, racing toward the door. He yanked it open and ran down the hall to his parents' room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mom, Dad," he cried, tears welling in his eyes. "There's something under my bed." His parents, groggy and confused, followed him back to his room. His dad flicked on the light and knelt down, peering under the bed. "There's nothing here, bud," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But I heard it," Tommy insisted, his voice trembling. "It talked to me." His mom knelt beside him, rubbing his back. "It's just a bad dream, sweetie," she said softly. "There's nothing to be afraid of." Tommy nodded, though he wasn't convinced. Reluctantly, he climbed back into bed, his parents reassuring him as they turned off the light and closed the door behind them. The room fell silent again, save for the faint rustle of the wind outside. Hours passed. Tommy lay awake, staring at the ceiling, too scared to sleep. His body was rigid with fear, his mind replaying the voice over and over again. He must have finally dozed off, because the next thing he knew, it was pitch black. And then, he heard it again. "Tommy, come play with me." This time, the voice was louder, closer, right by his ear. Before he could scream, icy cold fingers wrapped around his ankle, yanking him down toward the foot of the bed. He thrashed, kicking wildly, trying to pull himself free, but the grip was too strong. The shadows under the bed seemed to stretch and expand, pulling him down into the darkness. He screamed for his parents, but no sound came out. His room, once familiar and safe, had become a trap, a nightmare come to life. As he was dragged under the bed, the last thing he saw was a pair of glowing red eyes staring back at him from the abyss. And then, silence. The next morning, Tommy's parents found his bed empty. The window was shut, the door locked from the inside. But Tommy was gone, vanished as if he'd never existed. The only thing left was a faint, scratching sound coming from under the bed. In the small town of Millstone, there was a shop no one talked about anymore. a dusty little building on the edge of town that had been abandoned for years. It was called the Dollmaker's workshop. When parents passed it with their kids, they would quicken their pace, murmuring to stay away. The windows were boarded up, and vines had crept up the walls, but everyone knew the story behind it. Everyone except for 10-year-old Emily. Emily and her family had just moved to Millstone, and like any curious child, she loved to explore. Her parents warned her to stay away from the old parts of town, especially near the Dollmaker's workshop, but that only made her more curious. Why was everyone so afraid of it? One bright afternoon, after her parents left to run errands, Emily snuck out of the house and made her way to the old workshop. It wasn't far, just a few blocks down, and the closer she got, the quieter the street became. It was as if the town was holding its breath. The building loomed in front of her. Faded letters spelling the Dollmaker's workshop hung above the door, which was cracked open, just enough to invite her curiosity. With a nervous glance over her shoulder, Emily pushed the door and stepped inside. The smell of dust and old wood filled her nose, but what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Shelves lined the walls, each one crammed with dolls. There were porcelain dolls, rag dolls, dolls with glassy eyes, and some that seemed almost real. Their faces were too perfect, their eyes too lifelike. They all seemed to be watching her. As Emily wandered deeper into the shop, her fingers brushing over the doll heads, she noticed one that stood out. It was seated alone, perched on a small wooden chair in the back of the room. The doll was a little girl, about her size, with long blonde hair and eyes that seemed to shine, even in the dim light. Her face was flawless, but something about her expression gave Emily chills. The doll wasn't smiling. It looked sad. A small plaque in front of the doll read, "The Lost One." Emily's fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the doll's face. The second she did, a cold gust of air blew through the shop, rattling the windows and making the dolls on the shelves sway slightly. Emily pulled her hand back, suddenly wanting to leave. But then she heard it, a faint giggle. Her heart raced. She looked around, but she was alone, or at least, she thought she was. The giggle came again, this time louder, as if a child was standing right behind her. Emily spun around, but there was no one there. The shop was still, the silence heavy, except for the soft creaking of the floorboards. Emily backed away, her eyes darting toward the exit, but before she could leave, she heard a voice, soft, whispering, "Come play with us." Emily froze. Her eyes locked onto the doll, the one she had touched. Its eyes, once glassy and still, blinked. She screamed and bolted for the door, but as she ran, the dolls on the shelves began to move, their heads slowly turning to watch her. Their eyes glinted, their painted lips twisting into eerie, unnatural smiles. "Stay and play forever," the voices echoed, coming from everywhere at once. She reached the door and yanked it open, tripping over the threshold in her panic. But as she tumbled out onto the sidewalk, she heard the last, chilling words from behind her. "You can never leave." Emily ran all the way home, not daring to look back. She slammed the door to her house, gasping for breath, her heart pounding in her chest. When her parents came home later, they found her curled up in her bed, pale and shaking. The next day, the local news reported something strange. The old Dollmaker's workshop, long abandoned, had burned to the ground overnight. No one knew how the fire started, but the strange part was what they found in the rubble. Among the charred remains of the dolls was one that had survived. A doll with long blonde hair, sitting perfectly upright amidst the ashes. The plaque in front of it read, "The Lost One." From that day on, Emily never spoke about what happened in the workshop. But whenever she passed by the now burned ruins, she could swear she still heard the faint sound of giggling, like the dolls were waiting for her to come back. When you're 10 years old, the things that scare you are usually the stuff of nightmares. Monsters, ghosts, and, for Timmy Benson, clowns. He wasn't sure when it started, but ever since his 7th birthday party, when a clown had gotten a little too close, he couldn't stand them. Their painted faces, wide grins, and unnatural movements made his skin crawl. His parents always told him it was just silly, that clowns were supposed to be fun. But Timmy knew better. It was a cool October evening, a few days before Halloween, when Timmy's family moved into their new house. It was an old Victorian home, The kind with creaky floorboards and long hallways. The kind of house that felt alive. His parents were thrilled about it, calling it a great fixer-upper. But to Timmy, it looked like something from a scary movie. His new room was huge, with tall ceilings and a big window that let in the moonlight at night. Everything seemed perfect, except for one thing: the closet. It was massive, with a heavy wooden door that creaked every time it opened. His parents thought it was great for storage, but to Timmy, it was unsettling. There was something about the closet that made him feel watched. That first night, Timmy lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to get used to the strange noises the house made. The wind howled outside, and the branches of the trees tapped against the windows like bony fingers. He pulled the blanket tighter around him, his eyes drifting toward the closet door. It was closed, just like he had left it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it, watching, waiting. He closed his eyes, trying to sleep. But just as he was about to drift off, he heard it. A soft giggle, faint but unmistakable. Timmy's eyes shot open, his heart pounding. He sat up in bed, listening intently. The house was quiet. Maybe it was just the wind. He shook his head, trying to convince himself it was nothing. But then the giggle came again, closer this time, like it was right outside his door. Timmy's breath caught in his throat. Slowly he turned to face the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just a crack, but enough to see the blackness inside. His stomach churned with fear. Hadn't he closed it? Trembling, he got out of bed, tiptoeing across the room. He reached for the closet door, his hand shaking as he grabbed the knob. With a quick yank, he slammed the door shut, locking it with the old brass key his parents had given him. He sighed with relief, backing away from the closet. But just as he turned to head back to bed, he heard it. The faintest sound of breathing. It was coming from inside the closet. Timmy froze, his heart thudding so loudly he thought it might burst out of his chest. He wanted to scream for his parents, but something held him back. Something about the soft, rhythmic breathing that kept him rooted in place. Suddenly, a voice whispered from behind the closet door, so soft he almost didn't hear it. "Timmy, come out and play." His blood ran cold. It was a high-pitched sing-song voice, playful and eerie, like someone was trying to mock him. He stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. The door rattled, as if something was trying to push it open. "Timmy, don't be scared. I just want to play." His mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Clowns weren't real. Monsters weren't real. It was just his imagination, right? But then, the rattling stopped. The room fell silent, so quiet that Timmy could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe he was half asleep, dreaming. That's when the closet door slammed open with a force so strong, the walls shook. Timmy screamed as a figure emerged from the shadows of the closet, towering over him. It was a clown, but not the kind you see at parties. Its face was grotesque, with smeared white paint, wide red lips that stretched into a wicked grin, and dark, sunken eyes that gleamed in the moonlight. Its clothes were old, tattered, and stained with something dark, too dark to be just dirt. The clown held out its hand, its long fingers curling like claws. "Come play with me, Timmy," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Terrified, Timmy scrambled back, tripping over his bed and hitting the floor hard. He could barely breathe, his chest tightening with fear as the clown stepped closer, its footsteps slow and deliberate. "You can't hide from me," the clown hissed, tilting its head to the side. "I'm always here, in the dark, waiting." With one final burst of courage, Timmy bolted from his room, racing down the hall to his parents' bedroom. He banged on the door, screaming for help. His dad burst out, confused and worried, but by the time they returned to his room, the closet door was closed. The clown was gone. His parents didn't believe him. They thought it was just a nightmare brought on by the stress of moving. But Timmy knew better. He knew what he had seen. The clown was real, and it was still there, waiting in the closet, waiting for the next time the door creaked open. When 12-year-old Sarah moved to a new town with her family, she didn't expect to be the new kid just before Halloween. The sleepy little town of Hollow Creek seemed ordinary enough. Quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and a school that seemed straight out of a movie. But there was one thing that everyone warned her about: The woods. The dense forest that lined the back of the town, dark and endless, was something the kids whispered about in hushed tones. They called it the Whispering Woods. Whenever Sarah asked why it was called that, the other kids would just shake their heads and say, "You'll see. Just don't go there after dark." Sarah didn't believe in spooky stories, and she didn't think the woods were anything special. But when her new friend Jenna invited her to a Halloween sleepover with a group of girls, they dared each other to visit the woods at night. "It's a rite of passage," Jenna had said with a smirk. "If you can spend 5 minutes in there, you're officially one of us." Eager to prove herself, Sarah agreed. She didn't want to seem like a scaredy cat on her first Halloween in Hollow Creek. That night, the girls gathered at Jenna's house, their costumes abandoned for flashlights and blankets. The air was chilly, and the full moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the trees. After hours of ghost stories and giggles, the group finally made their way to the edge of the woods. The trees loomed over them like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the cold breeze. Sarah felt a strange unease as they neared the entrance, but she pushed it aside. "It's just a silly dare," she told herself. "There's nothing to be afraid of." The girls stood at the edge of the woods, their flashlights flickering as they dared Sarah to go in. Jenna grinned, her eyes gleaming with excitement. 5 minutes, that's all. Walk straight ahead and come back." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself as she stepped into the trees. The moment she crossed the threshold, the world seemed to change. The air grew colder, the sounds of the night, crickets, distant owls, faded away, replaced by an unsettling silence. With every step deeper into the woods, the darkness seemed to thicken, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, but the further she walked, the more she swore she could hear something. Soft, barely audible, but there. Whispering. She stopped, her heart pounding. She turned the flashlight in a wide arc, expecting to see one of the girls hiding in the shadows, trying to scare her. But there was no one. Only the trees, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, casting long, eerie shadows. Then she heard it again, closer this time. Sarah, her name, carried on the wind, barely a breath but unmistakable. She froze, her mouth dry, her legs shaking. Someone was calling her, but it wasn't the girls. Their laughter and chatter were distant now, far behind her at the edge of the woods. "Sarah, come deeper." The voice was soft, almost soothing, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made her skin crawl. She turned around, ready to run back, but when she shined the flashlight toward the entrance, the path was gone. It was as if the trees had closed in behind her, sealing her in. Panic surged through her. She started running, crashing through the underbrush, calling out for Jenna, for anyone, but the whispering followed her. It was all around her now, coming from the trees, the ground, the very air she breathed. "Sarah, stay with us." She stumbled, her foot catching on a root, sending her sprawling to the forest floor. Her flashlight skittered away, its beam fading into the distance. She scrambled to her feet, but the whispers grew louder, circling her like 1,000 voices all speaking at once. "Stay." Suddenly she saw it, just ahead, through the trees. A figure, tall and thin, its silhouette barely visible in the darkness, but unmistakable. It was watching her. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it emerged from the shadows, Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't human. Its face was pale, stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes were empty, hollow pits of darkness. "We've been waiting for you," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. Sarah screamed and bolted, not caring which direction she ran, only that she had to get away. The whispers chased her, growing louder and louder until they drowned out everything else. The trees blurred around her, the ground shifting under her feet, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Finally, she burst through the trees and collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. The girls were there, waiting at the edge of the woods, their faces pale with fear. "What happened?" Jenna asked, her voice trembling. "We heard you screaming." Sarah tried to speak, but no words came. She glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching her. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. She never told them what she saw. But from that night on, she stayed far, far away from the whispering woods. And every time the wind blew through the trees, she swore she could still hear it, the faintest whisper, calling her name. It was the summer of 1998, and 10-year-old Jake was excited to spend the break with his best friend, Billy. They had been inseparable since kindergarten, and this summer was supposed to be all about building forts, riding bikes, and playing hide-and-seek in the nearby forest. Their small town didn't have much to do, but they made their own adventures. There was one rule, though. Don't go near the old railroad tracks. The tracks, abandoned years ago, ran through the forest on the outskirts of town. Parents always warned their kids about the dangers there, telling stories about accidents and disappearances. But like most kids, Jake and Billy didn't take the warnings seriously. They loved scaring each other with stories about the tracks. One humid afternoon, Billy showed up at Jake's house with a wild idea. "Let's go check out the tracks," Billy said, his eyes shining with excitement. Jake hesitated. They weren't supposed to go there, but Billy's enthusiasm was infectious, and he didn't want to be the one to chicken out. "All right," Jake finally agreed, "but we're not staying long." The two boys grabbed their bikes and headed for the woods, the sun hanging low in the sky. As they pedaled down the dirt path, the trees grew thicker and the sound of the town faded behind them. Soon, they reached the edge of the forest, where the old railroad tracks stretched into the distance, covered in weeds and overgrown brush. Billy jumped off his bike, grinning. "See? Nothing to be scared of." Jake wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the tracks. The air felt heavy, and even the birds seemed quieter here. But he didn't want to ruin the adventure, so he followed Billy as they walked along the tracks. For a while, it was fun. They laughed and joked, daring each other to walk farther down the rusted rails. But then, as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees, something changed. Jake noticed it first. The air grew cooler, almost cold, and a thick fog began to roll in, creeping through the trees like ghostly fingers. He shivered, rubbing his arms. "Hey, Billy," Jake called. "Maybe we should head back." Billy didn't answer. He was a few steps ahead, staring at something just beyond the bend in the tracks. His eyes were wide, his face pale. "Billy," Jake said, walking closer. "What are you looking at?" That's when Jake saw it, a figure standing in the fog just off the tracks. It was tall and thin, draped in a long, tattered coat. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but Jake could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, as though it were looking right through him. Who is that?" Jake whispered, his throat dry with fear. Billy didn't respond. He took a step forward toward the figure. "Billy, stop." Jake grabbed his friend's arm, but Billy shook him off. "I have to go," Billy said in a flat, distant voice. "He's waiting for me." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. "No, we need to leave." He yanked at Billy's arm again, but it was no use. Billy kept walking as if in a trance, his eyes fixed on the figure. Panicking, Jake looked around for help, but the fog had swallowed everything. The trees, the path, even their bikes, they were all gone, lost in the thick mist. All that remained was the old railroad tracks and the figure in the distance, watching. "Billy, please," Jake shouted, his voice cracking. He couldn't let his friend go. He grabbed Billy with both hands, pulling with all his might. But Billy didn't stop. He kept walking, step by step, until he was almost at the figure's side. That's when the figure raised its arm, pointing to the fog, beckoning Billy forward. Jake screamed, lunging for Billy one last time. But just as his hand brushed his friend's sleeve, Billy stepped into the fog and disappeared. Jake stood there, frozen in place, his mind racing. 1 second, Billy had been right there, and the next, he was gone, swallowed by the fog as if he had never been there at all. "Billy," Jake screamed, his voice echoing through the empty forest. There was no answer. The fog swirled around him, thick and suffocating, and Jake felt utterly alone. Tears filled his eyes as he backed away, stumbling over the tracks. His heart raced, and fear clawed at his throat. He didn't know what else to do. So he turned and ran as fast as he could, yet not stopping until he burst out of the woods and into the fading daylight. When he reached his house, out of breath and shaking, he tried to explain what had happened, but his parents didn't believe him. They called the police, but no one could find Billy. No footprints, no bikes, not even a sign of him. It was like Billy had never existed. The town held a search, but after weeks of looking, they called it off. The police said Billy must have run away, But Jake knew the truth. He knew Billy hadn't run away. He had been taken by whatever lived in the fog by the old railroad tracks. Years passed, but Jake never went near the tracks again. He grew up, but he never forgot that summer, and he never stopped hearing Billy's voice, soft, distant, calling to him from the fog. "Jake, come find me."